pleasure to introduce Marc today. My day job is to be at Truist Financial, and it's also a pleasure and privilege to serve on the board of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, the best World Affairs Council chapter in the country, led by our fearless leader, L.J. Stanley. So Marc here has worked for 26 years at the CIA before retiring in July of 2019 at the Senior Intelligence Service level. He was one of CIA's most highly decorated operations officers who served in multiple field and headquarters assignments for the US government. Marc has received umpteen awards, and his distinctions include the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the Intelligence Commendation Medal, and the Intelligence Medal of Merit. He specialized in counterterrorism, the Middle East and South Asia, including extensive time in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just prior to his retirement, Marc served at the CIA headquarters and was in charge of CIA's clandestine operations in Europe and Eurasia. So I'm sure we'll hear comments about the current Ukraine-Russia conflict as well today. He frequently comments on international events in the US media that includes the Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News, Yahoo, CNN, and MSNBC. He also writes a weekly column on intelligence as a Washington Examiner contributor, and currently is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Marc's book, by the way, which is available at the end of today's program, including signing, is Clarity in Crisis, Leadership Lessons from the CIA, and that was published by HarperCollins in June of last year. Please extend a warm welcome to Marc.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here in Charlotte. I live up in Northern Virginia, but I'll tell you, we have a house in the Outer Banks, so I certainly pass through North Carolina, and one day I will, I'm sure, have North Carolina license plates on my vehicle. Look, it's an amazing honor to be here to talk to a group which obviously is made up of distinguished members of the Charlotte community, but also I love seeing the 5 high schools here, and I'll make a special pitch at the end to the high school students in terms of public service. I served for 26 years at CIA, serving one's country in whatever manner, whether it's in the intelligence community, the military, if you want to become a cop, a firefighter, anything, working for your country is something that's really noble. So I hope that my talk today lights a spark among some of the students here. I start all of these talks with a joke, because you kind of have to. Sorry, and I have to commend everybody here who I've met over the last 24 hours who's pronounced my last name correctly. But the joke is as follows, and I was in 2006, I was the deputy station chief in the Middle East, in a country, of course, I can't tell you, sorry, just based on the secrecy obligations, but I was the deputy station chief. There was a regional crisis going on, and I got a call on our secure line, we call it the Green Line, at this US Embassy. And it was the briefers going down to see then President George W. Bush, giving him what's called the President's Daily Brief. Anyone here knows what the PDB is? How about some of the college kids? PDB it's the secrets of the kingdom. And so that's a briefing the president gets every morning from his intelligence advisors talking about what's happening in the world. So it's the most important briefing, the most important document in the US government. So the briefers are going down to talk to George W. Bush, and they call me to ask me my assessment on a certain situation, which for me was a really big honor. So I talked to them about it, and they said, we'll be back in a couple hours. We're going to call you back and tell you the reaction of the president. So I wait, and later that evening, about 10 o'clock, I got a phone call on the Green Line, and they said, hey, we're back from the Oval. And I said, how'd it go? And they said, it went fantastic. So I said, what did George W. Bush, what did the president think about what I had to say? And they said, well, we actually sat around the Oval Office, and the president was just trying to pronounce your last name the whole time. That is my claim to fame. Not all those fancy awards you heard about. I love that joke, and George W. Bush was a great consumer of intelligence, but I could actually very much see him sitting around saying, what's that Greek kid out there? Polymeropoulos. Again, thank you very much for having me here today. As I was trying to think about what to cover in these remarks, and there's so much that's going on in the world. Obviously, I wrote a book on leadership, and not to hawk my book, but it's certainly available, and I'd be happy to sign it. But I think it's better off that I talk about some current events, in particular what's happening between Ukraine and Russia. We could talk a little bit about leadership, but I think what's happening in the world today, really groundbreaking events. Europe has seen seismic changes, and so we'll talk about that. You know, if anyone cares to watch on Morning Joe or kind of read some of my writing in the Washington Examiner, I say a lot in this as well. So you know, hear me out, because I really think it's an important time for the world. Let's start out about you know, a question, and you know, particularly for the high school kids here, why we care about Ukraine, right? Pretty important question. Lots going on in the world. Obviously, lots going on in the United States, but Ukraine is important, and I'll tell you why. And in particular, you know, the war in Ukraine has really garnered extraordinary emotions amongst people like me, who are, you know, veterans of the U.S. intelligence and military communities, because in my view, it's the classic case of good versus evil, of David versus Goliath. And if you think about it, what's happened in the previous 20 years? Well, we fought 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that kind of moral clarity, that lack of ambiguity, is really prevalent now. But that absence of moral clarity in those conflicts really haunted and I think troubled many of us who served. And you know, like myself, who saw my friends not come home. And some of us had trouble, you know, processing the worth of sacrifices made. And you know, for myself, I'm not saying these were not just causes, and I served with a lot of pride and distinction in both conflicts. But we also were there for a long time. It was 20 years, and so you know, in my view, there's a really big difference between what we've seen in Ukraine and staying for a long time, both in South Asia and of course in Iraq. So the last 20 years, I'm sorry, have been messy, and there's many scars that have been both seen and unseen, you know, remain for those that serve. So I think that's why you see now so many U.S. military veterans, you know, people who've left the service, actually want to travel to Ukraine to fight. It's an amazing phenomenon if you see that. I'm not sure it's a great idea, because you know, I think that, you know, the U.S. government can take care of things on their own, but it's worth noting the deep emotional attachment that many in the national security community really have towards Ukraine now. So here we are. You know, Ukraine is on what we call, you know, our front sight post, and for reasons I've just stated, it's a conflict that really burns intensely in our desire to make things right. Again, a David and Goliath story, and it resonates amongst my old tribe, members of the intel and special operations communities. One of the things that is worth noting, and again, why this I think resonates so deeply to me, is that, you know, in many cases we live side by side with our partners. That would be Iraqis or Syrians or the Afghans. You know, for myself, you know, we relied on them for shelter. We fought with them. And so, you know, when practicing unconventional warfare, it comes down to these personal relationships. And so, you know, that's why I think when it comes to Ukraine now, you know, this is something that we think a conflict that's going to be different. Because I think, you know, unlike what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, again, where I served with a lot of pride and we did a lot of good things, in this case, we actually can help our friends in Ukraine actually prevail. So there is that sense of moral clarity. So I throw that out there. And then when you talk about leadership, the Ukrainian leader, President Zelensky, you know, he's almost a Churchill-like figure now. He's inspiring the world. It's pretty extraordinary. He's leading from the front. You know, his famous phrase when the U.S. at one point tried to extract him out of Kyiv, he said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammo." That was you know, it was brilliant on so many levels. You know, I think I know him in North Carolina now, but when I gave this talk in Texas, I said, you know, it inspired so many of us. You know, Ukraine is Texas, and Mariupol is the Alamo. So I speak with my colleagues, you know, my retired colleagues on a daily, if not hourly basis, and really the sentiment is we all are Ukrainians now. And I think back to my time, you know, and you know, much closer to somewhere in the high school students here. We'll go to college, and then you know, perhaps join the U.S. government. But I wish I was that young case officer that I once was, heading out, going to Europe. You know, as when I was CIA's operations chief, overseeing all of Europe and Eurasia, I used to tell our new officers they had a chance to do 2 things: both witness and then sometimes shape history. And I imagine our officers today have that precise feeling of responsibility and opportunity. And in particular, I think about my colleagues now who actually are in the special operations and intelligence communities. You know, what are they thinking? So again, imagine for the last several years, so the fact of the matter is, since 2014, we have been working with the Ukrainians. So this is what I think is firing, you know, on all cylinders in their brains today. You know, we've been with them. We have been with our Ukrainian brothers and sisters who have battled the Russians for 8 years. They're now in the fight of our lives. And we have faith in our Ukrainian partners to actually not only just fight, but to win. And a lot of people ask me, why do you think the Ukrainians are doing so well? Well, matter of fact, there's been 8 years of war in eastern Ukraine and Donbass. This is a laboratory in which the U.S. Special Operations community and our Ukrainian partners studied Russian tactics. And while we may have obviously overstated the prowess of the Russian military, I think that, in terms of the Ukrainians and their will to fight, there's no one in my old world who was surprised. And we really do believe in their cause. And so, what I would call, and I do all the time, I call on our policymakers to do more. Send more weapons, provide more training, provide that tactical intelligence for the Ukrainians to win. Don't be paralyzed by that fear of escalation. And because after all, this is, in my view, kind of really the great fight of our time. One of the things that happened before the war, so someone with a hand up. You want to ask a question already? I'm going to call on you after you did that later. One of the things that is really remarkable is that the intelligence community really did hit a home run before the war. They did receive extraordinary praise, and rightfully so. But one of the things that's really interesting is what we call authorized disclosures. And that's when the administration really flooded the zone with disclosures of intelligence. It was really a revolution. It's groundbreaking. It's basically declassifying intelligence and making it operational. And one thing that's really interesting to note is these deliberate disclosures were designed to stop the war. This was before the Russians invaded, not to promote one. So I think that's something that is, when we talk about operationalizing the intelligence, really important. These are not leaks, and this is in fact the way to kind of counter Russian disinformation tactics. It's done purposefully and with careful consideration, and it really was designed as a deterrent. Now it didn't, it kind of got in Russian President Vladimir Putin's head a little bit. It didn't work. It didn't deter him from invading, but it certainly helped rally our NATO allies, and that's absolutely critical. And if you remember, even the Ukrainians didn't believe it when we actually went to them and said the Russians were going to invade. What does sea change in thinking? So, for example, back in 2014, if you remember, when Russia annexed Crimea, or even in 2016, when the Russians, with their disinformation operations, interfered in our elections, the intelligence community had this information but decided not to use it. Decided not to. The administrations at the time decided not to publicize it, and so I think that there's a realization now amongst the current national security team that it was the right thing to do, and so I give them some credit on that. The Russians actually invaded, as the intelligence community predicted. One thing to note on that, so this is good, we got it right, but this is really not what intelligence is always designed to do. It's not the intelligence community's place to necessarily tell the policymakers the time and place of an event if it's to occur. It was collected, we did that right, that's outstanding, but in reality what intelligence should be doing is providing a warning function, and so I don't want us to get kind of too far ahead of our skis and expect that the intelligence community is going to do this each time. The whole point is what you want to do is prepare our policymakers for potential end games, and that's what we did. So where do we go from here in terms of what CIA and the National Security Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, where does the IC go from here? And I don't think anyone's resting on their laurels. If you think about it, the CIA and really the Special Operations Commander is really built to provide the Ukrainians the assistance they're receiving now. So we're obviously going to support the Ukrainians with training and material assistance. Special Operations Command Europe, an organization called SOCER, that was designed primarily for this reason, to counter a Russian invasion of Europe. So for 70 years, this organization existed, and so it's being put to good use. Sanctions, I think, have been a very good step, but as I talk about in the media very often, when it comes to Ukraine and it comes to what we're doing and how this will end, I'm going to just be brutally honest, the only metric that matters will be the number of body bags that return to Russia. Sorry, that's a little graphic, but I think that's the truth. In terms of Russia itself, what are we looking at? We're going to focus on signs that the Russian regime is cracking. The intelligence community certainly has to look for and encourage Russian diplomats and intelligence officers serving at Russian embassies abroad who are making the decision on whether to jump ship or not. I mean, in my view, that every U.S. embassy should hang a welcome sign for any Russian official who wants to defect or work for us quietly. Because ultimately, if you're a Russian official right now, you're serving overseas, what are you thinking about if you have to return home? Your country has become a pariah state. The economy is being devastated. Your president is labeled correctly a war criminal. So I think we're going to look for signs that there's going to be some defections amongst the Russian security services and diplomats. You're also going to look for signs about the Russian oligarchs, another kind of foundational piece of the Putin regime, and if they're going to jump ship or not. There's been this incredible, I don't know if any of you have followed this, this very amusing kind of thread on social media about tracking the yachts of the Russian oligarchs and how many countries are seizing them. So I think that's really good as well. I think ultimately, what happens with the oligarchs is going to be pretty telling. Let's talk about Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader. The evolution of Zelensky has been extraordinary. From the voice, he was literally the voice of the Ukrainian version of Paddington Bear. I think he was also on the Ukrainian version of Dancing with the Stars, but now he's this Churchill-like figure. What a journey this has been. Pretty extraordinary. As someone who studies leadership, I marvel at him. It goes to the notion that I really believe that leaders are not born, they're made. Wearing a T-shirt, using social media to talk to his people in the world. His defiant statements are slogans for the ages, and I mentioned the send ammo, not a ride. It's just fantastic. When he addressed the European Parliament several weeks ago, European parliamentarians were crying. What an inspiring figure, and he really has become a global force. And what an incredible difference between Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, who sits when he greets those leaders who choose to call on him. He greets them in his palace, isolated in this elongated table, just this kind of bizarre scene, seemingly miles away from anybody, including his national security team. So, what a difference in leadership between Zelensky and Putin. So we're at the 3-month mark now. So what do we have to do? And I would argue we have to keep the boot on Putin's neck. I think I've watched with a sense of horror the atrocities, the Russian atrocities. Not unexpected in my mind. If you look at Russian history, their actions in Syria, back in Aleppo several years ago when the Russian Air Force killed 4,000 Syrian civilians. I have a lot of pride in the response from the West, and this is on a bipartisan basis. I think it's one of the things that can actually unite both Republicans and Democrats is the need to support Ukraine. Perhaps it's a little slow at times, but the United States and certainly Europe has come around, and we're supplying the Ukrainians with an incredible amount of weaponry. And so we live in these challenging times, but I really do believe that good is going to prevail, and that the Ukraine, our Ukrainian brothers and sisters really can win this fight. There's also some interesting things that have happened in terms of my old world and the intelligence community. There's been a mass expulsion of Russian diplomats from overseas postings. Over 400 Russians have been kicked out all over Europe, and it's extraordinary. It's the largest expulsion of hostile intelligence officials I've ever seen in my lifetime. And this should put a really big dent in Russian intelligence operations in Europe, because Europe has really been their playground. They've wreaked havoc there for years, including election interference, assassination operations. So I give a lot of credit to the administration for orchestrating this international campaign. And again, I would think that both U.S. and our allies are going to take a crack and try to recruit some of these Russians. The notion that I kind of repeatedly talk about in the media is that Ukraine can win. If you remember, we thought that Kyiv would fall in about 3 days. That was proved totally incorrect. So let's just say that again, Kyiv can win. I'm sorry, that Ukraine can win. And so what does that mean? It means that Ukraine be allowed, it is their country, to eject Russian military from all the lands that Russia is currently occupying. And I think with increased Allied assistance, this can happen. I also don't think we've reached that sweet spot where we have the maximum amount of economic and military pressure. Because we do have to worry about escalation with NATO. So I think we must continue to provide Ukrainians with artillery and anti-ship missiles. Do I advocate the introduction of U.S. Ground troops and U.S. troops? Absolutely not. That's not necessary. But we do have the boot on Putin's neck. And I always say, I make the kind of the statement that we don't have to be trapped by this fear of nuclear escalation. I don't think we're there yet at all. And I think that one of the things that people forget is that when a bully picks on you, you got to punch him back in the nose. I'll never forget the words of former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis when commenting on a 2018 engagement in the Syrian desert between members of the U.S. Special Operations Community and 300 Russian mercenaries. And Mattis said the following: "My direction to the chairman was for the use of force, and then to annihilate the Russians." And that happened. And guess what? There was not a peep from the Russians after that. So the Russians, if you take away anything out of this, the Russians are not 10 feet tall. Kind of a final point. I think there's a question of morality and ethics here. I saw this happen in Syria, where there was this kind of a policy of doing just enough to help our Syrian allies, but not allowing them to win. And so, and you kind of, I get that sense that this kind of thinking is creeping in. It certainly is something that the French and the Germans are advocating. They're worried about humiliating Putin. But I think there's a morality issue there, and coming from someone who was someone on the ground. I was an operator on the ground, so I would be working with my Ukrainian allies, and I can't imagine the shame if I had to look someone, a Ukrainian, in the face and tell them we're just doing enough for them. We just want them to negotiate. I would prefer to actually let them win, and I'm sure my colleagues in the intel and special operations world feel the same way. So, ultimately, the question of will Putin go nuclear again, I just want to reiterate, I think that we're far from that place. The U.S. intelligence community is laser focused on the Russian tactical and nuclear posture with air, sea, and land. I think if we see movement, we'll certainly hear about it, but I'm not as concerned about that. And I also think that we would lean on the Chinese very heavily if we thought that was going to happen. Kind of a last piece. What do we do about Russia in the future? Because this conflict will eventually end. And I'll tell you, I remember digging up a mass grave upon our infiltration into Iraq in April '03. And what haunts me from that time is not the bones and the skulls that I saw, but it was the villagers coming out, the Iraqi villagers coming out, even years after the event, having really precise recollections of what happened. The Russians have committed heinous war crimes, just as Saddam Hussein did in Iraq. It's been documented what the Russians are doing in extraordinary fashion for the world to see, and so where we are now is truly awful. But make no mistake, we have to hold Vladimir Putin accountable. The U.S. intelligence community is collecting on this, but we can't let Putin and his military get off the hook. And so I think aggressively pursuing war crimes will be paramount, both ensuring accountability, but even now, perhaps even as a deterrent for Putin's possible use of tactical nukes. There has to be a reckoning for those Russians who committed these atrocities. That's kind of my 2 cents on Russia-Ukraine. I'm willing to take any questions. Let me just kind of give one small piece again for the students in the room. I was a middle-class kid growing up in New Jersey. My parents didn't have a hell of a lot of money. I was lucky to go, obviously, to go to college. I received my undergraduate and master's degree. And as I was trying to figure out what to do in life, the federal government was a calling, and I wanted to work in national security. And I'll tell you, for 26 years, I served my country. There's a lot of things happening in the United States today, which I think that certainly are upsetting to a lot of us. But I still go back to a sentiment that I felt as I was walking down the street one day, and I looked up at an American flag. It was in the Middle East at night. There was a silhouette of an American flag, and I looked at that flag, and I had a sense of pride that I was one of 30 Americans who was living in that country. But I also had a sense that this was a country which didn't have democratic freedoms, no political or economic freedoms. But I knew that the world, and particularly that people, looks at that flag and they think that America actually means something. So I throw that out to the group today. I still believe that this is an exceptional country. There's a notion of America as a shining city on the hill. Where I've lived, my whole the last 26 years, primarily outside the country. This is still an extraordinary place. The political and economic freedoms, which sometimes seem that they're tested, still is something that the entire world looks up to. So I would hope that the young folks here today think about service for your country, not only because you're helping your fellow Americans, but really the world looks to us to lead on these areas. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
I'm Marc Polymeropoulos on the board of the World Affairs Council. We're in CIA mode today, so we're going fast-paced. Going to try to get as many questions in as we can. There are 5 high schools here. We're not going to get each high school to stand up individually to ask a question, but what I would like you to do is do them in 2 blocks. And we'll do one block first, which is going to be Olympic and Mallard Creek, and 1-sentence questions. and then we'll come back to the others, Audrey Kell, Myers Park, and Hickory Ridge, a little bit later. Get them ready. One sentence from each one of you, if you could. Before we get Mallard Creek and Olympic up, I wanted Mark to briefly talk about, if he would, some of these leadership lessons that hopefully all of us will take away from this, especially high school students, and two in particular. One is humility and the ability to pick yourself up and dust yourself off. And I think he might even use an analogy, a basketball analogy that we recognize here.
Thanks. So sometimes I'm embarrassed in plugging my book, but if you're going to do it for me, thanks so much. So I wrote a book. It's called Clarity in Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the CIA. It was my contention at the end of my career that I was a very good leader by the end, but for the majority of my career, perhaps I was not. But I found myself at the end of the career in times of crisis being very comfortable. That was my happy place. When you have this kind of gray area where there's a lack of situational awareness, when you don't know what's going on, I was actually able to lead effectively. So I'm going to throw out a couple leadership principles, and we'll just start with the one which I'll just do two or three of them. First one was the idea, I call it the glue guy or the glue gal. So think about it, again, this is for the students here today. This is the idea that not everybody is going to be an all-star. But you have to recognize and appreciate indispensable members of your team. And so think of what you do. If it's a school club or a sports team, anything, look at the people behind the scenes who are actually helping you, and really foster that sense of team effort, and really look at those unsung heroes. And that's really important because when times are tough later on, you're going to rely on those folks. Another principle that I talk about is that adversity is the performance-enhancing drug to success. So I'm not advocating taking steroids or anything like that. But adversity is the PED to success, because what does that mean, adversity? Well, it's something that we all face in life. I certainly did on multiple occasions. But it's the idea that your super fuel in how you grow is going to wait when something bad happens and how you come back from that. And there's a billion different analogies I have from my old world of special operations and intelligence, but let me just throw out a question here. What happened Michael Jordan's sophomore year playing basketball in high school? He got cut. Do you think he quit? I don't think so. And so that's the kind of super fuel that you have. So think about your lives, and I think about my life too. I think about whether it's things that happen in my personal life or my professional life. I think about sports teams. Adversity is going to be something that unfortunately does occur, but it's going to be that fuel that kind of drives you and makes you grow. And everybody faces adversity in their life. So please kind of take that with something that is, I think, really important, is how you grow as a leader. And then the last thing we'll throw one more in there is about humility. So people ask me all the time, and it was very kind in the introduction, all the kind of fancy hardware I received from CIA. And if anyone wants to, not the high school kids, but if anyone wants to come over to my house in Vienna, I'll take you downstairs with a glass of Jameson, which, as you all from last night understand, that I enjoy sometimes. And I'll show you all these awards. But the other part of that, those successes, was the fact that I'm an incredibly humble person. Because that's a really important trait in my old world of intelligence operations. What does humility mean? It means that don't walk around thinking you're such a badass, because there's always things right around the corner that are going to get you. And so you have that sense of humility. You have that sense of taking ownership for mistakes. And so to me, when you see a humble leader, it's also someone who, again, when times are tough, is really going to react in the appropriate manner. And I'll throw one more. One more principle from the book. I call it family values, and that's a very kind of common phrase, but it's the idea of when you want to lead teams, when you want to have be part of kind of elite groups of individuals, you have to have that love for one another. And it's a word I use all the time. It's a word we had when on small teams I participated at CIA, and I talk about it with sports teams all the time. But it's having that tight bond when you look to the left and right of you, and understanding that in order to get through really tough times, in order to lead under times of crisis. Crisis can be defined as anything that happens. It can be something that happens in a boardroom, something that happens in a school. But you've got to have that love and that respect and that empathy for one another. So think about that. Think about how you treat other people. Think about that kind of understanding. And if you have that, great, really high-performing teams always have that love. It's a word that I use all the time. Not everyone's comfortable with it, but I like it.
We're going to go to Lori and your crew at Olympic and then Mallard Creek. One sentence questions. We're going to get Mark to react to both of them at the same time. Then we're going to open it up to others, and we'll come back to the other three high schools for one sentence operations. Please.
All right, so I had a question now. Richard Childress of Richard Childress Racing donated 1 million rounds of ammo to Ukraine, I want to say about 2 months ago. And I was wondering if you think that the ammo donations or firepower donations should be on the government or on the business moguls of America.
Thank you. And you used "and" in the middle of that, so I guess it's one sentence. Mallard Creek, you got a one sentence? Mallard Creek, you with us? Please.
If you don't mind, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. You expressed your liking of the mass expulsion of Russians in intelligent positions. My question is, what do you believe this means for the general Russian re-inclusion or lack of Russian re-inclusion to overall national security or international intelligence relations moving forward after the war?
That covers the waterfront. Richard Childress.
I love it. Two great questions, and then every time I talk about foreign policy with young folks, I always underestimate how smart everybody is. So those are two great questions. First of all, let's I got to throw something in about NASCAR because my son, who's in college now, he was a wild Tony Stewart fan. So I've been to tons of NASCAR races. So I actually went to the NASCAR Hall of Fame yesterday. So and took some pictures of the 20 car. But so I think the question was, is it appropriate for private citizens in the United States, and particularly Richard Childress, racing to donate funds for the Ukrainian effort? And, as long as it's legal, it's fine, and it does help. And I think that that sense of kind of civic duty is really important. I think a lot of those donations were done at a time when a lot of people thought the U.S. wasn't doing enough, and so I think that's things have gotten much better. But as long as one abides by these kind of laws, I think there's nothing wrong with it at all. And I think that certainly the Ukrainians welcome it. And if it can fill some kind of gap that the U.S. government is not doing, that's fine as well. So I think it's important to do that. And then for the second question, in terms of the expulsion of the Russian diplomats, so two things. This is going to put a dent in the Russians' ability to collect intelligence because their officers are not on the ground. But I think you put it, there's a really good point there. It also is going to be, it puts a dent into what we call their ability to have or to foster liaison relationships with other countries' intelligence services. And that's really important too, because when you have this united effort to crack down on the Russians, the Russian intelligence presence overseas, you're taking away their ability to recruit spies, but you're also taking away their ability to work with other countries. So I think that's a good thing. Ultimately, what happens in the future? I mean, at some point we're going to have to, Russia will be, reintroduced into the international community. I think it's going to have to be a time without Vladimir Putin, and the Russian intelligence services will play a role there. But ultimately, at this point now, it's an extremely effective step in kicking out intel officers, and I think you're going to see more of that, in the days and weeks to come.
And I call on people, so Bill McNamara, I'm about to call on you for a question, but for anybody above high school age, now is the time. So Bill, do you want to open up, please?
I mean, this wasn't staged, but I actually wrote it down. Old school flip pad. Two questions on your mentoring keys to leadership. I'd like to talk about a couple of those if you could. And then tell us a little bit about your delegation to the acting chiefs when you were leaving sites overseas.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to finish your story of the trip back when your mom died,
Okay.
and the story of your dad at the medal ceremony.
Sure. So I think these are some vignettes from the book, which are kind of near and dear to my heart. But one of the things I talk about in the leadership principles is called mentoring, and that's again, it's an absolute critical part of later on when you have a crisis situation. Looking back at your team is, have you taught everybody how to lead? And so, when I was in Afghanistan, I was a base chief running a CIA paramilitary base along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. This was 2011 and 2012. I was there for a solid year. I had 20 Americans there and I had 1,000 of our Afghan allies with us, and we fought Al-Qaeda and the Taliban every day. But one of the things I would do is, in order to train the personnel under me, because it's my contention is, I'm here on Earth for a short amount of time, but it's going to be much more important for me to pass the torch to others, to teach them how to lead. And so what I would do is, on an informal basis, If I was, for example, leaving the base for several days or so, maybe to go to another part of Afghanistan or go to Kabul, the capital. What I would do, I would just informally kind of anoint someone as the base chief, and I would give them time, their ability to lead. And I'll never forget, as I was jumping on a helicopter, flying out, one of my officers said, hey chief, hey Mark, I'm going to hold down the fort until you get back. And I remember, not necessarily the right thing to do, but grabbing him by shirt collar, I said, no, actually, you're going to lead. You're going to do everything as if you were actually the one really in charge. And so I want you to learn from this. And so it's just the notion of giving people the opportunity to learn to lead, I think is incredibly important. Another story, it goes back to that concept of family values. And so, again, this is on that Afghanistan deployment. My mom passed away. I was 6,000 miles, away from New Jersey, where she lived. I was on the Pak-Afghan border, and I had to get home. And as I jumped on the helicopter, I would have to take multiple helicopter flights. We were trying to go through a mountain pass, and kind of clouds rolled in, and so terrible visibility. And I'm on comms with the pilots, and they're just sitting there hovering. And I just said, hey, let's just turn around. This is not worth it. It's not safe. They didn't listen to me. They made several attempts, and we eventually got to another helicopter landing zone where I had to kind of keep hopscotching to get home. But I asked them, I said, why did you do this? And I said, that wasn't safe. And these are veterans of the U.S. Military Special Operations Aviation units, who then went and joined the CIA. But they looked at me, because every great pilot has a southern drawl. They looked at me and they said, hey Mark, this is what we do. Your mom died. We're getting you home to her. And I was totally choked up with emotions on that, because when I go back to family values, about building teams where people had that love for one another, I'll never forget that moment. So that was pretty important.
Carol, we're going to you, and then the gentleman behind you. And Mark, if you wouldn't mind repeating the question,
okay.
At least the one you want to answer, so for our video audience.
Enjoyed very much hearing you speak. Can you speak to what the CIA may be thinking about Putin's mental health?
Yep.
Did they see it deteriorating? Anything you can share about that?
Sure.
And did they see this coming? This invasion, this full-scale invasion?
So two great questions. One is what has to do with, well, first of all, did we see the invasion coming? And the other was the kind of the status of Putin's mental health. So let me start with the notion of did the intelligence community get it right? And the answer is yes. And it's clear that I don't know this. I'm not in government anymore, but it's clear we stole the war plans. It's pretty good. And so there were such definitive statements that we knew that Russia was going to invade, that it's clear to me that based on our collection, we got them. And that's a huge intelligence coup. But it was just a forcefulness, and of course it was proved to be correct, which always helps. So yes, so the answer is that we did know it was coming, and it's not only just from obviously getting hold of the war plans. There's all source collection as well. So you see Russian units staging and massing, and so the interesting part is how so many people around the world didn't think, even when the evidence was so clear that this would be kicking off. They just didn't believe it. I think there was a lot of wishful thinking on the part of many of our European allies that Putin would never do this. In terms of the question of Putin's, not only mental health, but his health in general, there's a really interesting report last week. Michael Weiss, who's a journalist for Newsline, obtained a copy of a recording of an oligarch talking about how Putin has cancer. And so, this is uncorroborated, we don't know yet, but what is interesting, it's interesting for a couple reasons. One is, does Putin have a sense of that, time is not on his side? Did he launch this invasion because he is ill? And then you asked the question about, so who knows? But that's really interesting. But in terms of his actual, the status of his health right now, are those of us who, do kind of, make these assessments on Putin's, perhaps willingness to use weapons of mass destruction. I think if there are questions of his mental health, that throws that into kind of an area where we're very uncomfortable, because you hope that you want to make sure that he's rational, and so if there's something wrong with him, maybe he's not. So these are really important questions. Bill Burns, the CIA director, was asked this by the Financial Times last week, and he declined to even comment on it, which gives me kind of the suspicion that there's something to it, but it just remains to be seen. You see Putin, you see video or images of Putin. He kind of has splotchy cheeks. He looks tired. Doesn't look so good. Now, of course, he's at the age where most Russian males die right now. But ultimately, I think there seems to be some kind of degradation of his health. But that's, I don't have access to that information, but it's certainly worth examining, because it has so much. There's so much weight on: will he withdraw? Will he resort to tactical nuclear weapons? If something's wrong with him, cognitively, I think that's something to worry about.
Mark, just kind of a corollary question. People have been trying to get in Putin's head for a long time. Do you have any special insights, we affectionately call you a spook, from the CIA into the mind of a KGB guy?
Yeah.
There's a bunch of politicians trying to understand him. Do you have any special knowledge?
So, what a great question, because I think that so much of what Vladimir Putin does is based on his time when he was in the KGB. That's under the Soviet Union, that was the secret police, and then of course he became the chairman of the FSB, the head of the Russian Internal Service. And so these are organizations that are defined by competition and paranoia and conspiracy. In my interactions with the Russian security services, maddeningly frustrating. I've talked about this in public. In meetings that I had with the Russians, they would raise things like we would complain about something, and we're having it. So we by the way, we did for a long time meet with the Russian security services. It's good to have that channel open. But for example, on one we were talking about kind of some cyber issues, and the SVR officer I was talking to, who was a general, launched into a long diatribe about the U.S. treatment of Japanese Americans in World War II. And I'm thinking, and this is it's a weird, conspiracy-minded, strange a group of folks. I don't have very high regard for their intellect. I will say one last piece on Putin, though. It's really important. A really good friend of mine, Julia Yaffe, she's a brilliant analyst on Russia. She's born in Russia, speaks Russian. She called Putin in a column the other day a street urchin. And what does that mean? But it was really interesting, because Putin grew up in these kind of collectives where the kids were abandoned by their alcoholic parents, and they all just sat around, or they congregated in areas where there was terrible abuse, physical abuse. It was kind of every man or every boy for himself, and so he has this sense of this kind of bizarre sense of being wrong since a young child. So I think it's a combination of his upbringing, but also his previous life as a KGB officer that makes him who he is. But frankly, he's a bully, and what do you do with a bully? You got to punch him right back. Can't be scared of him.
That's a New Jersey guy talking, by the way. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask about Putin and cancer, and you covered it.
Okay.
We have John Gallis, and then over here to Mike.
I'd like to shift it just to the other ocean. I read recently that China's made a deal with Solomon Islands for a Navy base. Any thoughts or comments about that?
So, I think that one of the things that, and I believe,
Question, Mike.
oh, sorry, essentially, the question has to do with China. And China reportedly made a deal with the Solomon Islands for a Navy base. But I think, fundamentally, one of the things that the war and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has taken our eye off the ball was what is our greatest strategic threat, and that is China. I think there has been kind of unanimity in the national security circles on this, from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. So no one doubts this. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin launched there's a land war going on in Europe, so we have to, we obviously have to pay attention. But President Biden, I believe, is leaving today or tomorrow on a trip to Asia. And so, understanding the long-term strategic threat of China is absolutely paramount. If you look at how we are, funding and arraying our military, it's all focused on China. I think there'll be some alterations now, obviously, in Europe, especially with NATO enlargement, and probably more of a kind of shifting of some U.S. forces there. But there's no doubt that China is our longest term and greatest strategic threat. And so I'll throw it out there when I talking to the students in the back right now. If you ask me what should I study to go to into national security, I would say doesn't matter. But my next response is learn Chinese, or maybe Arabic or Russian, or Farsi. But if you want to have a job in national security, focus on China, learn Chinese, and you'll be forever employed, even more so than I was.
And that's true pretty much in every line of work too, by the way. I mean, that's what we tell lawyers to do, learn another language. Mike from EPIC out at UNC Charlotte.
Mark, great presentation. When we see things like Moskva being successfully targeted, my father's retired naval aviator, his last operational squadron was Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 2, so he was out there chasing when that was a Soviet ship. And so we know how good our tactical intelligence of things like that are. Is that successful attack evidence that NATO and or the US are providing tactical intelligence to Ukraine?
So I think that, the answer is, I'm sorry, the question was with the sinking of the Moskva, which was the pride of the Russian fleet, was that evidence of tactical intelligence being provided by the US or NATO to Ukraine? And the answer is, if you read the press reports, certainly there was some assistance given. But there's a couple points on that. One is, I don't want to denigrate the capability and the heroism of the Ukrainian forces. What happens in the United States is that our politicians don't know how to keep their mouth shut when it comes to intel, and it happens in every administration. So under the Trump administration, when we killed Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which I think was a very righteous and just act. You had administration officials bragging about it, which all of us blanched a little bit. We wish they wouldn't do that. Same thing now in the Biden administration. Obviously, tactical intelligence is being provided, and when the Ukrainians then go off and sink, the Russian ship, people in our administration can't help themselves but brag about it a little bit. That's just really unfortunate. I think it's happening, but again, don't take away from the heroism and ingenuity of the Ukrainians, because after all, while we might have provided some targeting data, that these were indigenously produced anti-ship missiles called the Neptune, and so this was not based on hardware given by NATO or by the United States. And so the last point on that in terms of tactical intelligence, and there's been some controversy over this, is that should we be doing this? Is it too escalatory? Well, I'll tell you, the Russians expect we're doing it anyhow. We seem to be, these are lawyers at the National Security Council fighting over language, where really if you're on the ground, the Russian military certainly believes we're doing it. I hope we're doing it. And if I was, an American, if I was a CIA officer on the ground or a member of our special operations units, I certainly want to be giving this to my Ukrainian partners, who I'm probably in Ukraine with right now. But the idea of us, not providing something that's going to help Ukraine win, I think is that's almost immoral. So.
Okay, we're going to try this real quickly. One sentence from Audrey Kell, Myers Park, and Hickory Ridge. So, Audrey Kell, are you ready? Or you want to? Will, there we go.
Good afternoon. My question is, in your book, you make a reference about we learn from the failures. What was your worst failure, and what did you learn from it?
Okay, your worst failure, you can remember that, right? Myers Park? Myers Park?
Given the comments from Putin, do you think the benefits of having Finland and Sweden in NATO outweigh the cost of more possible Russian aggression?
And I saw some hoo-hoos going from that lady when New Jersey was mentioned.
Right.
Is that it? There you go. Hickory Ridge?
Yes. So you served in the intelligence community for 26 years. What do you find to be your most challenging moment in those years?
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to combine the first and the last question, and then we'll talk about NATO. So the question has to do what was my most challenging moment, and also when did I fail, or what was my biggest failure. And this is an emotional topic for me, because I was one of the senior officers who ran an operation in 2009, in which we were running, or through a partner of ours, the Jordanian intelligence service, we were running someone we thought had access to senior levels of Al-Qaeda. It turned out to be a double agent. And on December 30th, 2009, during an operational meeting, he blew himself up, killed 7 of my friends. And I was, responsible for that operation. Easily the worst moment of my life. I remember, at the airport, meeting the family members of one of our officers who was killed. I remember standing up in front of a CIA station telling 400 people under my command that their friend, Darren Labonte, wasn't coming home. And so, things like that are just ingrained in you, and I think about it every day. When I was promoted to the senior intelligence services, which is the equivalent of, getting your first star in the U.S. military, I remember sitting in the auditorium thinking I wasn't worthy of it because I was responsible for some of my friends not coming home, and so that was the toughest moment in my career. And the only thing you can do is learn by it. And you know, when I talk about humility, that was a pretty humbling moment. That was a kind of a tough one there. And so on a more cheery subject, let's talk about NATO enlargement. And so, you know, the question had to do with, you know, what does Finland and Sweden bring to the table? And I think it's pretty extraordinary. So first of all, these are countries that were historically neutral, and very firmly so. Their populations, you know, adamantly opposed to joining NATO, and everything changed on February 24th when Putin invaded. I think that, you know, if you want to kind of dive into each one, so Sweden has a very, you know, it has an excellent defense establishment. They make fighter jets, they make subs, they're going to offer a hell of a lot to NATO. And then Finland shares an 810-mile border with Russia. So we just are, you know, we have an eye right into Russia. Finland has a very capable military intelligence service. And again, but it's the idea that you know, these countries are making this choice based out of necessity. And the last part of this, and the thing that I find most interesting, as we have, in my view, lived in fear of Russia far too long, is Putin can't do anything about it. You know, and all the bluster, and you know, perhaps they'll do some things in terms of hybrid warfare, such as cyber attacks. But both Sweden and Finland are, you know, their cyber defenses are very good. And so this is a seismic shift in Europe. I think it's certainly for the betterment of NATO. It's an alliance that, you know, several months ago people were worried about its relevance. It's pretty remarkable, but I think that there's tremendous benefits, and I can't even think of any costs.
So as Wayne Cooper comes up to close us out, let's give a big round of applause to Mr.
Mark, what a fantastic presentation, and we, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, want to thank you for such a great presentation and coming to Charlotte to be here. And we have a small token.
Right.
This can go in your basement.
There you go. Come over for a
Mark, incidentally, will be signing his book here immediately.